Hi guys, well, thank you for inviting us. My name is Yuri Weinberg. As they said in the introduction, I used to run marketing and student acquisition for Kaplan University, probably one of the largest schools as well as lead buyers in the industry. And quite frankly, my job was to make Bruce's job miserable on the increased supplier side of the house.
He did a great job.
And so until I remember about a year ago, Bruce said, like, you know what, so what if you go to the other side, and actually understand the supplier side as well, all joking aside, about a year ago, we said, what if we were to sort of apply all that sophistication that these for-profit universities have to the not-for-profit universities, and so I joined a company called highereducation.com, formerly known as CMN. It's a content marketing company that drives about 75 million visitors to content sites. And from there, so we build products all the way from inquiry generation to application services, enrollment services, retention services, and so forth. That's what I do. So quickly going to introduce my panel. Maybe start with you, Joe.
Sure. My name is Joe Laskowski. I'm the Managing Partner and Chief Marketing Officer for Higher Ed Growth. We are also an education-focused digital marketing agency, been in business going on 9 years, based out of Tempe, Arizona. Work with around 400 or so schools on a regular basis, generating digital prospects for them, as well as some SaaS services in the call center arena. So happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Bruce Douglas. I'm the CEO of Education Dynamics. Education Dynamics has been around for between 10 and 20 years, depending on your counting. It was a higher education kind of roll-up, private equity firm, bought 6 different companies and kind of smashed them together about 10 years ago. But the individual properties go back over 20 years. I've been there about 5 years. And basically, Education Dynamics services for-profit and nonprofit schools, generating prospects, as well as kind of outsourced digital and call center services.
I'm Dennis Ryan. I oversee compliance and regulatory affairs for 2U. Those of you that don't know 2U, we are a full-service, third-party servicer to nonprofit universities. We work strictly in the graduate degree program market. We provide marketing, admissions, student support, career support services to big nonprofit traditional schools like Berkeley, Yale, Chapel Hill, NYU here in New York. So I oversee kind of different functional areas related to lobbying, government affairs, internal audit, now that we're a public company since 2014, and other areas related to state authorization and licensure.
All right, so quickly, by a show of hands, so who works in the education industry directly or indirectly? So I see a lot of happy people here. That's good. So definitely no shortage of change in the education industry, right? Going back on memory lane, I've worked in the industry for about 7 years. We've kind of seen it all, right? So from incentive compensation to gainful employment, to TCPA, to misrepresentation, and so forth. What's interesting is when you talk to market analysts, they always think that the intent is to make the industry smaller, but it really is not. If you look at the online education industry, it's actually growing by about 8% year over year. It's a $23 billion industry right now and estimated to grow to about $30 billion by 2020. So really the purpose of the regulation is not to make the industry smaller, it is to focus on student outcomes. And what it does is it actually changes the players. It changes the players both on the marketing side, so on the provider side, so as well as on the school side. And today, so we thought it could be useful to talk about what are those changes, those regulatory changes, and what has been the impact on schools as well as marketing providers, and what can you do about it as well, so as a school or as an inquiry generator, and how can you leverage technology on that journey. So Joe, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask the same question to each one of you. Have the recent regulations caused you to rethink your marketing and lead generation practices?
Maybe some sleep deprivation. No, seriously though, It has everyone's attention, and I think the changes as it relates to the regulatory environment and compliance in general in EDU goes back a couple of years. Kind of started with TCPA. There was a lot of concern about how that was going to impact the industry. We've worked our way through that, and at about that time, I think we had to start making a conscious decision to make compliance a priority. And from that point forward, I think we started to see our industry change, and we saw some players come and go, move to other verticals, get out entirely, and we knew that in order to sustain the industry, we were going to have a much greater level of due diligence and compliance than we had in the past. So when you fast forward to the settlements in today's world, I don't know that it's causing us to do much different other than to pay attention to those and try to have a voice with the organizations so we can work together to build the right regulations. I just think it started a little bit sooner than the recent settlements.
Yeah. Bruce?
Yeah, I think I would second that. I don't think there's anything that we've done materially different in the last probably year or two. It was really kind of going back 4 or 5 years ago where the major changes took place, and I think everyone in the industry made a lot of material changes. But over the last years, it's really mostly about staying ahead of the curve, making sure you're doing everything right, making sure everything is running through compliance and legal, and obviously watching to see what big bodies like the FTC or the Consumer Financial Protection Board are doing, or the Attorney Generals are doing, and making sure that you're kind of a step ahead of where you think they're going. So I think playing it conservative, this is not an industry that is looking for cutting edge anymore. We're playing it very conservative, and I think that's the way to go. And almost everyone, we were saying this a little bit before we came out here, I think this is probably an industry, being blunt about it, that 4 or 5 years ago was filled with a lot of questionable sort of players. And the reality is most of those players have fallen by the wayside, and what is left standing are people that are doing it right. And there are always going to be some bad apples that are pushing the edge a little bit, but I'd say I've been really pleased over the last couple of years to see the self-regulatory kind of cleanup that's taken place. And I think that's a good thing for everyone.
Yeah, so I think I pretty much agree with both of those sentiments. I don't know that the last year or two has really changed our perspective. I think we've had to take a position early on that since we're not the university and we're sort of the brand stewards of some of these schools that some of them have been around since before the Constitution, that we need to be pretty focused on compliance and making sure that, similar to what you're saying, that we're ahead of the curve and understanding what the regulatory trends are, so that we have the people and processes in place before the legislation actually becomes a regulation. And our senior leadership has taken a position early on that compliance is super important in our organization working with these schools. And we have a team of 13 people just dedicated strictly to compliance.
Yeah. And so my next question is going to go to you as well, Dennis. I mean, and maybe we go the other direction. It's been an interesting question for myself as well. I mean, coming out of the for-profit world and now venturing way more into the not-for-profit university world, you can see that many of the rules and regulations only apply to for-profit universities, and obviously that creates emotion depending on what side of the food chain you are. I mean, so Dennis, maybe start with you. I mean, so should the regulator focus on student outcomes rather than making it sort of binary, right? For-profit versus not-for-profit.
Yeah. So I should have said in my intro, before working at 2U, I've been there almost 6.5, 7 years. I ran compliance for Full Sail University, which is a big entertainment media school down in Orlando, but a for-profit. So I have a pretty good perspective on the compliance side of both the for-profit and working with not-for-profits. But we've said almost from day one that there's a long-term correlation between the success of our company and our university partners and that of student outcomes. And I think that is definitely the trend, the regulatory trend at the moment. There's a big push towards transparency, I think, and equal assessment across for-profits and not-for-profits. And there's been a lot of recent regulatory banter coming out of the Department of Ed about really pushing accreditation, both the national accreditors who oversee the for-profits and the regional accreditors who oversee the not-for-profits, and kind of creating a little more parity as to what's required of all their university, and making sure that those accreditors are sort of keeping a balance as to what's required of each, regardless of what type of school you come from. So I think that'll definitely be a trend in the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we serve both for-profits and not-for-profits. While our business does skew a little bit towards for-profits at this point in time, we have to mind all the regulations that cover the entire industry. And so, yeah, I have a personal bias that says I believe every law should apply to all schools equally everywhere, and there shouldn't be any rules that apply specifically to for-profits. I'm not a fan of those sort of regulations, but no one really asked me. We got to react to the laws that exist and the regulations that exist. And certainly there's more scrutiny sitting on the for-profits than the not-for-profits. There's no doubt about that. But one way or another, I think our stance is always neutral. It's got to be about the consumer and got to be about making sure that you're making the proper disclosures at all time. And if you're doing that all throughout every touch point that you have with consumers, then for the most part, we view that we will be protected and our school and agency partners will be protected as well. And the reality is there are lots of checks and balances. They're not just regulatory. We self-check ourselves, and our school and agency partners check us as well. So the reality is all those checks and balances usually play out to a good place, and hopefully it will continue that way.
I kind of agree with Bruce. We're in the same boat. I think we favor for-profit education a little bit from a percentage perspective of services provided. However, the comparison of the two is it's a little rough for me because I feel like if student outcomes are the goal, why wouldn't it apply equally? That means that if the school has a not-for-profit designation, the student's outcome is not as important. It hasn't really made sense to us. So from that perspective, we would totally support regulations that will focus on student outcomes but have that apply to the entire industry, not a designation based on profit or for-profit. So that's kind of our stance on it.
Yeah, and Yuri, I would just add that the accreditation regulation is a Dear Colleague letter that came out of the Department of Ed just back this past April. So if anyone's kind of interested in understanding, I think, the shift that's going towards equality, it's a pretty good read if you want to look it up.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? I mean, so the Department of Education has defined 7 risk factors. These are demographic risk factors when assessing students. And in my prior life, so actually our chairman wrote a book called Change.edu that shows that if you normalize for those risk factors, that the student outcomes at for-profit universities are actually equal and in some cases even better than not-for-profit universities. And so from that perspective, so yes, indeed, you shouldn't make it binary, right? It should be all about student outcomes. And secondly, recently we did a research as well. So does the student actually care whether it's for profit or not for profit? Because ultimately it's all about him or her, right? So and students, quite frankly, don't care, right? So they care about outcomes. So they care about jobs. And bettering their lives. So I'm going to transition a bit and go into a bit more in detail on these different regulations, and we're going to start with TCPA. And gosh, I remember about 2 years ago, and I see Jeff sitting here as well. And a lot of us on the school side were frightened about TCPA. It was literally gloom and doom, right? So we thought the sky was going to fall. And it was very unclear what exactly so the regulation was and how it was going to be applied. And I guess I'm going to ask Dennis and Joe, maybe start with you, Joe. Is it clearer now? And what can schools do to protect themselves? Against the risk.
Sure. TCPA kind of reminded me of Y2K. The sky was falling. We were getting panicked phone calls about, we're not going to have any leads, and what is the impact going to be here? And we were actually quite perplexed by it. We were ready and had TCPA consent implemented in June, and the deadline was October. And right up until that deadline and shortly thereafter, we were still getting panicked phone calls about, what are the implications here? We felt from the get-go that the implications are zero if things are being done the right way. If you're using legitimate data from legitimate advertising by adding a consent with a checkbox that allows for that contact, there shouldn't be any concern. So it had zero impact on our business and our clients' business. When we fast forward to today, most of the industry has kind of adapted a general statement, a general consent, I would say. However, there are some different interpretations from different clients out there, and that has pushed us to a place where we've had to be able to support with technology specific consents, because their interpretation of the current TCPA regulation is different than perhaps a different university or school. So that's also working well. And if a particular school wants a consent read a certain way or presented a certain way because that's the way they interpret the law, it's supported. So I feel like we've reached a place where the TCPA has kind of settled down, and it's about as clear as it's going to get.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely something that blew up at the time that everybody was focused on and trying to sort through and figure out from a regulatory perspective, what does it mean, how does it affect us, and what processes do we need to change, if anything. When we analyzed the TCPA regs, we ultimately came to the conclusion that our phone systems and the manner in which our admissions counselors contacted prospective students didn't qualify as what they defined as an auto dialer, which is really what sort of put the additional requirements in place. So we didn't really change anything related to our business based on that. However, I would say it definitely is affecting how we're looking at our phone systems of the future, and whether that capability of auto dialing would make us be required to meet that regulation.
Yeah. And then maybe one or two follow-up questions there. I mean, so I did a very statistically insignificant research myself. I literally talked to 10 not-for-profit universities, and about half of them said TCPA does not apply to not-for-profit universities, and the other half said it does apply to us. I mean,
it definitely applies to not-for-profit
universities.
universities.
So I was just going to ask for your opinion.
Yeah.
I mean,
We're just saying our systems didn't
Yeah.
require us under the definition of the regulation to meet that requirement.
We've actually heard that also, where certain schools are saying to us that they don't think it applies to their nonprofits, and we have taken the stance that go back and read the laws and talk to your outside lawyers, et cetera, because this applies to everyone,
Yeah.
and that's always been our interpretation. But I think the interesting part is what Joe said, is that different schools have interpreted it a little bit differently in terms of what the disclosure should be, what the procedure should be, and in a funny sort of way, it's probably helped larger players like ourselves, because it actually took quite a bit of programming and actually operations work to make sure that you could speak a little bit differently depending which school was talking to you. And a lot of smaller players actually, that was a big burden on them. It was a couple hundred hours of programming to do X, Y, and Z, and only the slightly bigger players could kind of do it quickly and et cetera. But I think the reality is you got to do whatever it takes to make your partners happy, and if they interpret it a certain way, we can disagree with their interpretation, but we're going to do what we can to protect them and protect us at all times.
Yeah, so and then Joe, Performline has offered us a free drink every time we do a shout out to Performline. So how can we leverage technology to protect ourselves against the TCPA risk?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we've moved to a point where there's so much automation involved in the lead gen process and so much tracking, and companies like Performline, vodka soda please, offer services and technologies that help support that, right? We're able to track things from so early on in the process now, and it's gotten to a point where we're even passing the actual TCPA consent that was read or presented to a prospect in the lead string. So with technology and that level of detail, I think it's going to be a requirement going forward for anyone that's not doing it today. But we're already seeing that on a fairly consistent basis.
Yeah. All right. So switching gears now to gainful employment, a topic dear to my heart. Obviously, with the rising cost of tuition, I always, you may not have noticed, I was not born in the US, I was actually born in Europe, and going to school is, I went to the best university, and it was $300 a year. That was my tuition in Europe. I mean, so it is slightly different here, right? I mean, so and so clearly the rising cost of tuition and the ability to repay debt, I mean, so is a very hot topic, and as you know, the government has put in place quite a few metrics, whether it's debt to income or cohort default rate. I mean, so to hold universities accountable, right? I mean, so and so I'm going to ask a question to everyone in the panel here. I mean, so maybe start with you, Bruce. What's your opinion on the topic? I mean, so and what can schools as well as marketing providers do to help with gainful employment?
Well, actually think the rule's a pretty good one. From a pro-consumer standpoint, I think sometimes we get very industry absorbed and trying to step out. And if we're always thinking about student outcomes and thinking about the student, I think protecting them and making sure that if someone is going to spend X amount of money for their education, they should be gainfully employed at the end of that. But I think for the most part, as a kind of a service provider and as an agency, again, our job, we're a little removed from it. The laws it's really mostly about making sure that in our marketing we are not making any sort of claim about gainful employment that is not backed by hard statistics. And therefore, we got to make sure that we are using really only government source. This is true not just of gainful employment, really of many kind of marketing regulations that are out there, is to make sure that we are not coming up with our own statistics or not doing anything that we are kind of making up ourselves, and making sure that if we're going to make some sort of claim about an outcome, that it is backed by government statistics. But it's a scary line you're going down if you're going to make claims in that regard. So I think it's staying away from making those claims. It keeps everyone in the best protection.
Dennis, maybe you?
I sort of agree. I don't disagree with the logic behind the gainful employment rules as a measure of consumer protection. But this is one of those instances where it really generally does not apply to not-for-profits. And this is one of those pretty hard-line regulatory rules that was very focused on the for-profits and not on the not-for-profits. The only area where it would apply to a not-for-profit school is a non-degree program, like a certificate program, in terms of reporting requirements. So it's not actually something we and our partners are focused on because they're not required to report upon it.
A slightly different viewpoint from here. We took a data set last year from our organization and partnered with another big data company, and also used some data from the BLS website, which is available to the public. And in doing that, we took a look at gainful employment, and we started matching programs available in particular cities and markets with the jobs that were available and being filled according to the BLS data. And for the most part, in each of the different program categories, the data kind of clustered together where it was where you would expect it to be. But also in every one of those instances, there was somewhere between 6 and 15 serious outliers on the graphs, which meant that either there was a market that was grossly underserved by programs based on the job availability that was there, or the opposite was there was an abundance of programs related to a field that had no jobs in that marketplace. Since we've put that data together, we've shared it with a lot of our clients, and we've actually tried to bring a lot of awareness to it. We just spoke about this at AppSCU yesterday. And I think in getting the focus much earlier in the process to start looking at the availability of programs, and Grantham University just released an article about how they're partnering with a local employer that has tens of thousands of positions, and they're helping them with curriculum and tuition discounts. And I think there's a lot that can be done to help gainful employment. I agree with Dennis that it should apply to everybody equally. But there's some different viewpoints here that I think would be beneficial for the institutions to start looking at.
Yeah, AppSCU, I've never heard of this. I mean, it's probably some obscure organization. Just kidding. I mean, so Bruce, I mean, so do you think certain not-for-profit universities are actually leveraging gainful currently around certain program categories, right? I mean, so because they are shielded, these rules don't apply to them, which could be a source of students for them then, right? So,
no doubt. I mean, like all companies, and whether we want to call it a nonprofit university, a company in that sense, I think certainly they're going to take advantage of it. Anyone is going to take advantage of any opportunity they have, and I certainly believe that there are many nonprofits who've sensed, yes, there's a non-level playing field, and if that's the case, they're going to take advantage of it, and no doubt about that they're doing that in multiple marketplaces and even nationwide as need be. But as long as the rules exist, then they're going to take advantage of it. And if they should change down the line, then they'll adjust their tactics. But definitely, yeah, I believe there are plenty of them that are taking advantage of it.
I would say there's definitely Department of Ed buzz of creating more transparency around reporting that is not specifically gainful employment as a regulation, but is certainly leaning more towards transparency and reporting requirements that are similar to some of the requirements of gainful employment for the entire sector of the ed industry. So I think they're sort of working around that to get a little more parity as well.
Yeah. And then maybe Bruce and Joe, I mean, so do you see any specific program categories, right? I mean, so that are more affected holistically across the board, across all schools, maybe on the associates level, right? I mean, so and do you also see schools reaching out to you to say, hey, you know, I mean, so where is there market demand with good gainful outcomes? I mean, so sort of the reverse, right? I mean, so do you see that as well, or?
So one of the changes that we've seen recently that we didn't see coming was there seems to be a bit of a departure from the certificate type programs. When you mentioned degree types, a lot of institutions have looked at what's involved in getting a certificate and then how employable that prospect or that student is once they have that certificate. And they realized that they were so close to the curriculum on an associate's level degree that they're starting to abandon that certificate entirely for an associate's program in lieu. Those are the kind of things I think we'll continue to see, and I think it's a great direction to go, because ultimately it has to be about the employment. You know, can they get a job and can they repay the debt that they incurred? Yeah. So the fact that those types of things are starting to be looked at, I think is positive.
Yeah, we've certainly seen the same thing. There are many schools that have pulled back from. Certainly there's some that have gone away from certificate, move it towards associates, but clearly there are categories that have been lightning rods. So would that be kind of art programs, culinary programs, certain programs that were very, very expensive, but then the actual employment rate and the salaries that people were making out of it, sitting with tremendous amount of student debt at the end of the day. So I think a lot of schools realized those things were lightning rods, and you've seen just nationwide a lot of closures of schools and campuses and programs all across the board, but heavily in the certificate area and heavily in what I'm just going to call the arts/culinary arts areas in particular. I think we've seen hit.
Yeah. All right, switching gears again. I mean, so moving into incentive compensation, a topic dear to all of our hearts, I guess. I mean, so this pay for performance and sort of pushy sales tactics has been a hot topic in the education industry for at least as long as I was there. I mean, so and similar to gainful employment and TCPA, the regulation is not all that clear either, right? I mean, so to some extent, I mean, so you could argue, a cost per inquiry is pay for performance, right? I mean, so on one end of the spectrum, and and even on the bundled services side of the house, I mean, so for like the enablers like Dennis, it's still very unclear there as well. What is a bundled service, right? I mean, so and so team, I mean, so can you expand a little bit on your view on incentive compensation? Maybe Dennis, start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that anyone is in the online space, regardless of for-profit, not-for-profit, is pretty focused on. So clearly our admissions counselors are covered by incentive compensation because they are performing enrollment-related activities. Therefore, they're not allowed to be paid any type of incentive relatively other than flat salary and sort of merit increases that are not tied to enrollment whatsoever. So from a compliance perspective, obviously we're pretty focused on making sure it stays that way, since they're representing our university partners. And you mentioned bundled services, and that's something really the business model under which 2U and the other OPM providers have really fall under, which is basically saying you can have a revenue share or tuition sharing arrangement as long as you're providing a suite of services to the university partner, something other than just recruiting. So what does that mean? What is the suite of services? I mean, they're pretty clear on the types of services in terms of support, technology, marketing, and career services. How many do you need to have? Well, I would say probably you need to have at least 2 other than recruiting to be safe. It's certainly not 1, in my opinion, or probably in the opinion of a lot of education lawyers. So, obviously it's creating a space where you can't be just a recruiter in the education space and sharing revenue with any kind of a school.
Yeah, my take on it is this is one of those, probably true of just about every legislation, where there was the best of intentions, but a regulation comes in place that actually is having probably in some cases the opposite effect of what they had hoped for. service providers like ourselves that are not doing kind of revenue sharing deals, can only be paid on a per lead or per click sort of basis. And we actually think it would be in the best interest of the consumer, of the schools, of ourselves, if we were actually paid more on results and actually paid on enrollments or starts or applications. And I actually think that would actually be better for the entire industry if we were paid that way, but we're actually not allowed to. And so that's one of those things where the regulation is stopping us from doing something that I actually think would be beneficial throughout the system. And I don't think that when the legislators passed it, they actually thought it all the way through. And they were thinking about bad behavior, in certain admissions reps in certain schools, and they were trying to stop that, but didn't realize kind of how, when they wrote it, just how broadly it would affect it.
Well,
But,
I totally agree with you, because there were so many subsequent follow-ups in terms of additional guidance after the incentive comp reg changed that I don't think the department ever considered the vast scope of like how that was affecting the ed industry overall. So it's still not totally clear, but it's definitely more clear than it was when they initially just released the
I would
reg.
say once every 2 weeks or so, we are approached by some school who is asking us, well, you can do it on this basis, right? And we're like, no, pretty sure we can't. We'll go back and check with our lawyers again, but we know what the answer is going to be. But they still want to set up some sort of system that way. And one day, hopefully, they'll modify it with another rule that will allow for things. But right now, our hands are tied pretty tightly in what we can do and can't do, unfortunately.
And if you shop long enough, you will always find an attorney who agrees with you. Right?
Absolutely.
So when I was still with Kaplan, obviously it's hard to manage an admissions team. So a sales team. So when you can't incent performance, right? Are you aware of any sort of, alternative ways, to incent your admissions without tripping incentive compensation, obviously, whether that's overtime or, work from home or these type of,
Yeah, I don't know that overtime would be allowed, but there are non-enrollment related activities that are listed specifically in the Dear Colleague letter from like March of 2014 or something, but so those are, I guess, permissible under the incentive comp reg, but are they really like usable or manageable in a day-to-day way of motivating a sales recruiting team? Not really. I haven't seen it to be in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, we haven't found any flexibility, or none that we're willing to play in. It gets too gray, and we don't like playing in gray. We prefer black and white.
There was another area that was impacted here, and it's on the call center side for lead generation. 5 years ago, that was a sales job. And the more matches, quote unquote, prospects that you developed, the higher the compensation. That model has clearly changed as well, and now the emphasis in the call center is focused solely on quality control. And it went from a pay for performance type of job to an hourly / salary position where not playing by the rules can get you dismissed the same day, as opposed to the sales job that it was before. So we've seen a shift on the marketing side as well that was attached to the incentive compensation type of regulation.
Yeah, I guess that's a good segue to my next question, which is another perform line planted question. So make sure you're prepared for that. But all kidding aside, obviously, call centers still play a significant role in the education space, whether that's call verify or warm transfer inquiries. And compliance is very important in that arena, obviously. So what can schools and providers do, right? To maximize performance and mitigate risk as it relates to call center generated inquiries. Maybe Bruce, start with you.
Sure. Listen, compliance, and yes, we are two perform line partners, so I'll take it back to it as well later. But I think the reality is, no matter whether you're on the call center side or whether you're in digital marketing side, compliance is obviously crucial. And I think you can automate up to a point, and technology is great, but there's always a human element. So I think the best compliance programs are some combination of automation and human touch, and then training and retraining. So it's not just the compliance side, it's making sure that you have constant interaction, whether that be if you're running a call center, your QA team, your training team. It's pulling people off the floor on a regular basis and constantly training and retraining. And there's certain things, to Joe's earlier point, there's certain things that are one strike and you're out. Period. There's no questions asked. You've just walked out the door if you do certain things. And other things that can be remediated. But I think having that balancing act But for us, everything is taped, everything is held for, I'm going to cite the wrong numbers, 5, 7 years, whatever the number happens to be, and we're always both, using automated tools and then, manually listening and giving that feedback. But it's a reality of our world today. It's not going anywhere. If anything, it's just going to keep getting stepped up and more complex over time.
Joe, anything to add?
Just a little bit. It's interesting because it's starting to become less and less, but we still spend a good percentage of our time explaining to clients why a call center product today is actually safer for them. When we've reached the point I talked about earlier, how the entire process is tracked, and when you have a short form record, you know exactly where it was generated, the entire string is being passed to the client, and then there's a recording that's typically 7 to 12 minutes long of everything that was said on that call, including TCPA consent. I don't know how you get a cleaner example of whether things were done right or not. Unfortunately, there's still ways that fraud can be created on the web, but a voice recording of a conversation, short of someone manipulating recordings, I don't know how you can get a more solid way of determining whether or not things are being done the right way. Fast forward again a little more, and there's automation and technology today that transcribes the recordings, and there's automation that then audits the transcription of the recordings. Personally, I believe it's the safest type of prospect, and we do web-generated leads as well. We don't have anything against it, but I think anybody that's concerned about compliance, which everyone is, or they're concerned about call center, 5 years ago, I would have agreed. Where it is today, I think it's a really solid product, and it's probably one of the safer bets for schools.
Great. Last question, and probably most important question: if you had a crystal ball, where do you see the education industry as it pertains to the regulatory environment heading in the next 5 to 10 years? That would be part one of the question. Part two of the question. And by all means, you can reference to Donald Trump. How do you see the political landscape impacting the education industry, right? And maybe start with you, Joe.
To have a crystal ball would be fantastic. Yeah, I think you're spot on the political side. I mean, a lot is going to have to do with what happens in November. We're kind of hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. We're not even sure what the worst looks like. There's clearly a lot of emphasis on the regulatory environment right now. We don't think that's going to shore up anytime soon. We're actively trying to get more involved and bring the regulators and the industry together because we are in complete support of having regulations that are clear and concise. So what I see in the coming years is maybe a little more contraction in the space. There's going to be, as Bruce alluded to earlier, a handful of companies that are able to do things the way they're being required at that time. But we feel good about the industry, and I think 5 to 10 years long term, that it's still going to be here, and it's still going to be doing well, and it's just going to be a little more heavily regulated.
Yep. Bruce?
I think that's really, really well said. I don't have a lot to add to that. Look, I absolutely. The industry is going to be here. Education is always going to be needed. It's going to be needed more than ever in the future. Service providers are still going to be necessary because we're going to bring expertise. The expertise may vary. Certain schools may bring certain things in-house. Certain schools may rely more on third-party service providers. I also believe there will be some contraction in the industry. There'll be some shakeout. There'll be winners and losers in there. But I think one way or another, we'll all still be standing. And you're right. I think what happens in this election will say a lot for what the next at least 4 years look like in terms of at least the atmosphere. What gets passed, who knows? There's such gridlock in Congress. Who knows what can get passed? But I think this election cycle will portend a decent amount for the next 4 to 8 years for sure.
Yeah, and Dennis, other than the market value of 2U going to $2 billion, anything else you would predict?
That's it?
I definitely cannot predict that. Yeah, I mean, a couple of highlights. I'm not so sure the presidential election is that important as much as whether the Republicans or the Democrats or the majority in Congress. That certainly is critical on the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee. It's currently Republican majority. I think that's helpful to the industry. Political affiliations aside, generally the Republicans they don't regulate quite as much as the Democrats, and I think that's probably helpful. Mm-hmm. Keep an eye on the next Secretary of the Department of Ed. That's going to be super important. And then, as I mentioned earlier, start to follow that trend of the department and the regulators really putting pressure on the accreditors and how that will start leveling the playing field, both through the accreditation process and what will be the higher ed reauthorization process sometime in the next, hopefully 5 to 10 years, but more likely in the next 2 years to 3 years.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time. I mean, so if you have any questions, we'll be in the back, I mean, so we're hanging out here somewhere. I mean, so thank you again for the opportunity, and looking forward.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.